History has taught us that the Auschwitz concentration camp was a true hell. But if you were a woman, you had a date with the devil himself. From beginning to end, women were victims of the most horrifying acts of the Nazi regime. Beatings, rapes, forced prostitution, and the cruelest and most inhuman experiments. Those who arrived at the camp pregnant were forced to abort in the worst ways you can imagine, and if that weren't enough, they then tested brutal sterilization methods on them.
Nos decían, van a hacer todo tipo de experimentos con ustedes. Y el objetivo de todo eso es que nunca tengan hijos.
Most of them didn't live to tell the tale. Meanwhile, those who managed to overcome hunger, pain, and agony claim that a part of their being also died in Auschwitz. In this new video from Military History, we will learn about the torment of the women who ended up in one of the most terrifying concentration camps of World War II. Get ready to learn about one of the cruelest episodes of humanity.
No sabíamos dónde estábamos ni lo que nos estaba pasando. Cuando llegamos nos sorprendió el hedor bestial, terrible que había. Y ni un árbol, ni un pájaro. Un silencio absoluto.
Adolf Hitler built Nazi ideology on a profound racial basis. According to his view, all groups or peoples possessed inherent and immutable traits that were passed down from generation to generation. No individual could surpass the innate qualities of their race. For the Führer, these inherited characteristics were not only related to external appearance and physical structure, but also influenced modes of thinking, creative abilities, intelligence, cultural appreciation, physical strength, and military skill. Under these ideas, Jews were assigned a wide range of negative stereotypes and were considered a major threat. To maintain the purity of the German genetic heritage, the best option they found was to imprison and annihilate their principal enemy.
Luego nos pusieron un número en el brazo. A partir de ese momento, éramos solo un número. Después, llegamos al pabellón de los experimentos.
While the Nazis promoted reproduction among their people, they planned the total extermination of Jews in Europe. No distinction was made by sex or age, even children fell victim to the brutal Holocaust. However, the Third Reich frequently subjected women to cruel persecution solely because of their gender. In fact, certain spaces were specifically designated for female prisoners. Not only Jews, but also Romani, Polish, and additionally, individuals with disabilities. In May 1939, the SS opened Ravensbrück, the largest Nazi concentration camp established for women. It was discovered that over 100,000 girls had been imprisoned there when Soviet troops liberated the site 6 years after it began operating.
They made us stand for 24 hours in the square before sending us to the showers. There, we had to undress fully and wait for the Germans.
In 1942, a special complex for women was also established in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And it is here that we will focus to understand the greatest atrocities suffered by the victims detained in this notorious internment site. Some of the punishments inflicted were common to all the camps erected during World War II, such as euthanasia programs. This was part of the Nazi policy known by the code name Final Solution, which included mass shootings and the creation of gas chambers. This initiative, known as T4, was used in Auschwitz to mass murder Romani women and women with disabilities. However, it was only one of the terrible ways in which people could lose their lives. The German authorities sent prisoners to perform forced labor, under conditions that often led to their deaths. They were also particularly vulnerable to beatings and rape. In many cases, they were forced to have sexual relations to obtain food or satisfy basic needs. This occasionally led to pregnancies by Nazi men, and if the so-called racial experts determined that the child would not be able to Germanize, the mother was forced to abort in an environment where both her life and the baby's had a virtually guaranteed fatal outcome.
SS commanders of the concentration camps had a keen eye on the populations and wanted a clock-like scientific sweeping control of them. This included ordering any pregnancies to be reported and for the women to receive abortions. Tragically, such force upon reproductive rights produced drastic measures. The pregnant women of concentration camps had two options. They could face the abortion the Nazis forced upon them, or they could hope to acquire an abortion secretly through fellow inmates. These latter abortions were an effort and hope to save the life of the mother.
The idea of concealing abortions was part of the mutual assistance practiced by imprisoned women, who formed groups with the goal of helping each other survive by sharing information, food, and clothing. Often, they came from the same city or province, had similar levels and styles of education, or shared family connections. Even so, unless one of the individuals involved was a health professional who was also imprisoned, the risk of death from such procedures was no less. You might wonder, why didn't they wait for German medical attention in these cases? The answer is as cruel as the entire experience in the concentration camp. Auschwitz had the involvement of a large number of renowned medical professionals, though they carried out the lethal brutality of the Nazi regime. In fact, their involvement may have been directly related to some of the most atrocious crimes committed within the camps where prisoners were held. Women in these places were subjected to a vast array of completely inhumane experiments. Driven by the Nazi program, it didn't matter if the victims ended up dying or the suffering they endured along the way. Ruthless individuals conducted all sorts of acts, justifying them as tests to learn how to treat certain diseases or to gather data on human tolerance under various circumstances. Thus, some people were frozen to death by exposure to excessively cold temperatures. Others were inflicted with severe wounds that were then infected to observe how the body responded. After painful and exhausting examinations that lasted hours, many were often given a direct injection of phenol into the heart, which caused death to allow for an autopsy and further results to support the research. The possibilities for experimenting at the expense of others' suffering knew no bounds, extending as far as the imagination of the perverse SS and Wehrmacht doctors.
One of the most vicious experiments was the transplantation of limbs. The process consisted of amputating legs or arms, which were transplanted to other test subjects. Anesthesia was practically never used, so the unfortunate women experienced absolutely inhuman suffering. At the end of the experiments, they were given lethal injections and their bodies were burned.
Among those responsible for the horrifying experiments, there is probably no name more infamous than Dr. Joseph Mengele. He was interested in genetic issues and sought to study specific groups, such as dwarfs and particularly twins. In the initial phase of his experiments, he subjected pairs of twins and people with physical disabilities to special medical examinations that could be performed on living organisms. These procedures were generally very painful and became a harrowing experience for the hungry and terrified children. The victims were photographed. Plaster molds were made of their teeth and jaws, and their fingerprints and footprints were taken. As soon as he finished with these procedures on a pair of siblings or dwarfs, Mengele ordered their execution so he could proceed to the next stage of his experiments: the comparative analysis of internal organs during autopsy. Anatomical samples of pseudoscientific interest were preserved and sent to the Berlin Dahlem Institute for more detailed examination. However, these cruel experiments never yielded results of real scientific value. A particular case associated with the work of this Nazi figure was that of Ruth Elias. She was a young woman who was pregnant when she was transferred from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz.
Nazi medical experiments on pregnant camp inmates centered on studying the effects of starvation and malnutrition on pregnancy. In predominance, such experiments cost the lives of both the fetus and the mother. While the percentage of women who gave birth at Auschwitz was small, the majority would not survive, mostly ending in stillbirth or miscarriage. Without a doubt, the most traumatizing possible outcome was if the baby survived childbirth.
Ruth Elias survived the harsh conditions she faced, but something worse was about to happen. After she gave birth, the SS doctor ordered that her breasts be bound with a rope as part of an experiment to see how long her newborn daughter could survive without food. Although Ruth secretly fed the baby by soaking pieces of bread in water, the infant weakened and her stomach became distended from hunger. After seeing her suffer for several days, a Czech female doctor who was also imprisoned with Ruth convinced her to inject her daughter with a lethal dose of morphine, as she would not survive, thus ending her agony. Research on the effects of hunger on the human body continued under Dr. Johann Paul Kremer. He focused particularly on the liver and how it atrophied. After pushing his victims to the brink of death by starvation, he ordered them to be injected with phenol. At this point, it is necessary to review some key points. Hitler aimed for the Aryan race, which he associated with Germans, to endure while exterminating the Jews. Therefore, pregnancies among women of his racial enemy were a significant problem addressed with abortion. However, Auschwitz became a place where experiments were conducted to end this issue definitively through sterilization. The person in charge of this work was Dr. Clauberg.
Un buen día hubo una llamada especial. Clauberg en persona eligió a varias de nosotras. Formábamos filas de A5 y seleccionó a quien quiso. No daba miedo. Era pequeño, gordo, con sombrero tirolés, pantalón bávaro, medias blancas, grandes botas de montaña. No se correspondía con la imagen de las SS que una pueda tener.
But appearances can be deceiving. Karl Clauberg was a German who served as an infantry soldier during World War I. After that conflict, he studied medicine and eventually reached the rank of chief physician at the University Gynecological Clinic. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party while being appointed associate professor of gynecology at the University of Königsberg. During his career, he conducted research on female fertility hormones and their applications. This allowed him to meet important SS members, as he was responsible for treating the wife of a high-ranking official. In 1942, he contacted the leader of the organization, Heinrich Himmler, and requested the opportunity to conduct mass sterilizations for his experiments. After receiving approval, he began his experiments in December of that year at the Block 10 laboratory in Auschwitz. His goal was to find an easy and inexpensive method for sterilizing women. In 2 large rooms on the 2nd floor of the building, several hundred Jewish women from various countries lived. Clauberg developed a non-surgical method involving the introduction of a specially prepared chemical irritant into the female reproductive organs, which caused severe inflammation. The formaldehyde preparation intended for the uteruses of his test subjects was applied without anesthesia, causing immense suffering, permanent damage, and severe infections. After several weeks, the fallopian tubes would close and block forever.
La función del bloque 10 era llevar a cabo un segundo genocidio. En otras palabras, matar a personas que aún no habían nacido para que ya no hubiera razas indeseables.
Clauberg's experiments killed some of the women he used as test subjects, while others were intentionally executed to perform autopsies and compare results. The killings were cold and conducted under the guise of supposed science, though they were as violent and cruel as those on the battlefield. Beyond those who died, it is estimated that around 700 women were sterilized with this brutal and painful method. Himmler wanted to know how long it would take to perform this procedure on 1,000 Jewish women, and the doctor's response was satisfactory regarding the request. In June 1943, during the final phase of the experiment, he wrote a letter to the SS leader in which he stated, "The non-surgical method for sterilizing women that I have invented is now nearly perfected. If the research I am conducting continues to produce the results it has so far, then an experienced doctor with a properly equipped clinic and the assistance of 10 auxiliary personnel will be able to carry out the sterilization of hundreds or even 1,000 women within a single day." The Nazi authorities were more than satisfied with the conclusions of the experiment, but the feelings were completely opposite for the victims who endured it.
Nos llamaban por nuestro número y luego Clauberg u otro tipo nos inyectaba algo en la vagina. Y después nos decía, ya no habrá más niños.
As if that weren't enough, Karl Clauberg was not the only doctor whose perverse actions condemned thousands of women in Block 10 to suffering. He was not alone, and like him, Dr. Horst Schumann sought a convenient method of mass sterilization that would enable the Third Reich to carry out the biological destruction of the conquered nations. This figure had his own method for depriving people of their reproductive capacity. And as in other cases, it was accompanied by torture and pain for Jews and other prisoners. A special team was set up for Schumann in one of the Auschwitz barracks, and from time to time, several dozen victims were brought in for him to experiment on. The sterilization experiments involved exposing the women's ovaries to X-rays. The doctor applied various intensities at different intervals in search of the optimal dose of radiation. However, the exposure caused severe burns on the subject's abdomens, groins, and buttocks, and suppurating sores that were resistant to healing. A survivor of those dark days in the concentration camp recalls the horror she could see around her during the gruesome tests.
Con las primeras que recibieron rayos X fue muy rápido. Yo fui la segunda y pasó muy deprisa. Luego les tocó a otras y cada vez las exponían más y más. Yo apenas noté nada. Me dejó una manchita roja, pero nada malo. La primera no tenía ni eso, pero en la tercera la mancha ya era más pronunciada y en la cuarta aún más, y las últimas se retorcían de dolor, se sentían mal y tenían que vomitar.
Many of the women died from complications resulting from radiation exposure, and it was concluded that the results of the X-ray sterilization experiments were not satisfactory. In fact, in an article sent by Schumann to Heinrich Himmler in April 1944, he expressed a preference for surgical castration, as it was quicker and more reliable. This meant that Dr. Clauberg was the only one who had a relatively successful outcome in his research, although this did not make him any less perverse than the others. In fact, the day would eventually come when he had to answer for his cruel acts. At the end of 1944, as the Red Army approached the Auschwitz camp. The doctor moved to the Ravensbrück concentration camp to continue his experiments with Romani women. However, Soviet troops captured him there in 1945. After the war, Clauberg was tried in the Soviet Union and sentenced to 25 years in prison. But in 1955, he was released under a prisoner exchange agreement. That same year, he returned to West Germany, where he was reinstated at his former clinic with the aim of continuing his scientific work from before the conflict. The Nazi seemed to have escaped blame and responsibility, but his ego led to his downfall. He behaved oddly, openly boasting about his supposed achievements in developing a new sterilization technique at the Auschwitz concentration camp. This destroyed any chance of remaining unnoticed, and just a few months after his return to German soil, public protests from survivor groups led to Clauberg's arrest. Ultimately, the doctor died on August 9, 1957, before his trial. He spent his final days in the city of Kiel, Germany, where he suffered a heart attack at the age of 58. Nevertheless, he left behind a legacy of horror that continued to haunt his victims for a long time.
Nos decían, van a hacer todo tipo de experimentos con ustedes. Y el objetivo de todo eso es que nunca tengan hijos. Y desde luego se puede decir que lo consiguieron.
Forever marked by the brutal and cruel experiments conducted at Auschwitz, these women continued with their lives. Many were unable to speak about their suffering due to shame, and it took decades before they were able to share their stories. On that long path of suffering, the vast majority of them were never able to have children. That was the cost of surviving the darkest chapter known to humanity. And so, we come to the end of our video, and it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next installment as we continue to explore military history together.